9:05 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. An American F-22 Raptor and an Iranian F-14 Tomcat were closing the gap, at twice the speed of sound. This was not a routine intercept. It was a total failure of every failsafe in the theater. The question that would later haunt both Pentagon analysts and commanders in Tehran was not why the two aircraft met. It was why both pilots squeezed their triggers at the point of no return and nothing happened. The air at 30,000 feet was thin and freezing. Below, the Strait of Hormuz appeared as a narrow ribbon of deep blue water. The F-22, call sign Raptor 1, moved through the sky like a jagged shadow. Its pilot, Captain Miller, glanced at his primary flight display. The radar return was small. It was aggressive. It was an F-14, an aging legend of the Iranian Air Force. Miller checked his master arm switch. It was set to hot. His head-up display showed a solid green box over the target. The fire control computer was ready to send an AIM-120 missile across the empty sky. But Miller felt a strange weight in his chest. Usually, a Persian Gulf intercept ended with a professional turn and a wingtip. Today was different. The Iranian jet was not turning. It was accelerating. Inside the cockpit of the Iranian F-14, Major Javan was experiencing the same reality. His Tomcat was a relic of a different era, but it was still a lethal platform. His backseater, the radar intercept officer, shouted over the intercom. The target was dead ahead. Javan could see the silver glint of the American stealth fighter. It looked like a diamond suspended in the sun. Both pilots were now within 15 nautical miles. This was the merge. It was a high-stakes game of chicken at Mach 2. The rules of engagement were clear. If the contact did not deviate, it was a threat to the carrier strike group. The commands from the ground controllers were becoming frantic. The Combat Information Center on the USS Abraham Lincoln was a hive of controlled chaos. Hundreds of miles away, controllers watched the two digital dots on a dark screen. The dots were moving toward a single point in space. There was no time for diplomacy. There was only time for a tactical decision. The controller spoke into the headset. Raptor 1. You are cleared to engage if the contact crosses the line. Miller did not respond. His finger was already resting on the trigger. He felt the low vibration of the twin engines through his flight suit. The F-22 was the most advanced fighter in the history of aviation. It was designed for this exact moment. It was built to kill before the enemy even knew it was there. But the enemy did know. Major Javan in the F-14 adjusted his flight stick. He was not running. He was hunting. The two aircraft were now 10 nautical miles apart, then 7. The closure rate was staggering, over 1,000 knots. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 9:10 in the morning, above the Strait of Hormuz, the Combat Information Center on the USS Abraham Lincoln was bathed in a dim blue light. It was a room designed for silence and precision. But the silence was breaking. A radar technician leaned forward until his forehead almost touched the glass of his console. On the screen, the track for Raptor 1 was clear. The track for the Iranian F-14 was not. The technician spoke to the tactical air officer. Sir, I have a track split on the contact. It is ghosting. The officer moved to the station. Explain. Is it electronic warfare? Negative, sir, the technician responded. The signature is blooming. It looks like 3 aircraft. Then 1. Now it is off the scale. Thousands of feet above the water, Captain Miller was seeing the same thing on his glass cockpit displays. The F-22 was supposed to be the master of the electromagnetic spectrum. It was a vacuum cleaner for data. But the data was suddenly garbage. The green box on his head-up display began to flicker. It jumped from the center of his vision to the far left. Then it disappeared entirely. Miller keyed his radio. Guardian, this is Raptor 1. I have lost radar lock. My systems are cycling. The controller at the Combat Information Center responded immediately. Raptor 1. This is Guardian. We see the same. Reset your secondary bus. You are still cleared for the intercept. The contact is at your 12 o'clock. 8 nautical miles. Copy, Miller said. His voice was flat, professional, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. He toggled the switches on his side console. Nothing changed. The most sophisticated fighter jet in the world was suddenly blind. Inside the Iranian F-14 Tomcat, the situation was even more chaotic. Major Javan felt the heavy vibration of the old airframe as he pushed the throttles forward. His radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Farzad, was screaming over the intercom. "Javan, the radar is dead. Everything is dead." Javan looked at his instrument panel. The analog dials were spinning in circles. The fuel gauge dropped to 0 and then snapped back to full. The radio was filled with a sound like tearing silk. It was a high-pitched static that bypassed his volume controls. It was painful. The Iranian pilot pulled his oxygen mask tighter against his face. "Farzad, switch to manual. Use your eyes." "Where is he?" "I cannot see him," Farzad replied. "He is stealth. He is a ghost." "He is there," Javan growled. "He has to be there." The two aircraft were now 6 nautical miles apart. At their current closing speed, they would occupy the same point in space in less than 20 seconds. Usually, at this distance, the American pilot would perform a vertical climb to show the underside of his jet. It was a signal of dominance. It was a way to end the encounter without a shot. But Captain Miller could not climb. His flight computers were fighting him. The fly-by-wire system, which translated his stick movements into wing adjustments, was lagging. The jet felt heavy. It felt sluggish. He looked out through the canopy. The sky was a perfect, empty blue. He searched for the smoke trail of the Iranian twin engines. He saw nothing. Then, a flash of silver caught the sun. The 14 was not 6 miles away. It was closer. Much closer. The radio in Miller's ear suddenly cleared. It was not the controller. It was a voice he did not recognize. It was not English. It was not Farsi. It was a series of rhythmic pulses that sounded like a heartbeat. The distance was now 4 nautical miles. The collision was no longer a mathematical possibility. It was an imminent reality. 9:12 in the morning, above the blue expanse of the Gulf. The warning signs were no longer subtle. They were physical. Inside the cockpit of the F-22, Captain Miller felt a rhythmic thrumming in his flight stick. It was not the vibration of the engines. It was something external. It felt like a heartbeat, a low-frequency pulse that traveled through the airframe and into his bones. He looked at his primary flight display. It was a digital mess. The icons for his missiles were flashing red. The computer was reporting a system-wide critical failure. But the engines were still running. The wings were still holding. Miller forced himself to look away from the screens. He looked out the canopy. The Iranian 14 was a distinct shape now. It was 3 nautical miles away. It was a twin-tailed hunter from another decade. It was closing the distance with terrifying speed. The American pilot spoke into his radio. "Guardian, I have visual. The contact is at 3 miles. My weapons are showing offline. I am attempting a manual override." The response from the Combat Information Center was garbled. "Raptor 1. We are losing your telemetry. The contact is target. Confirm engagement." "I cannot confirm engagement," Miller said. "My fire control is down." He was now in a position that no F-22 pilot ever expected to be. He was in a visual dogfight with a target he could not lock. The stealth advantage was gone. The technological edge was gone. It was down to a man in a seat and a stick in his hand. Inside the Iranian Tomcat, Major Javan was fighting a different battle. The old 14 was manual by nature, but its systems were still vital for survival. The cockpit was filled with the smell of ozone. Small sparks jumped across the analog dials. His radar intercept officer, Farzad, was breathing hard over the intercom. "Javan, look at the water." Javan glanced down. The surface of the Persian Gulf was no longer calm. Below the two aircraft, the water was churning. It was not a wake from a ship. It was a massive, circular disturbance in the ocean. It looked like a white eye staring up at the sky. The Iranian pilot ignored the water. He focused on the silver shape of the Raptor. It was beautiful. It was the apex predator of the skies, and it was right in front of him. "I have him," Javan whispered. "He is in the crosshairs." He reached for the weapons release button on his flight stick. He did not need a radar lock. At this range, he could use the internal cannon. Or he could fire a heat-seeking Sidewinder missile, but as his thumb moved to the switch, the heartbeat pulse grew louder. It was no longer just a sound, it was a pressure. It pushed against his chest. It made his vision blur at the edges. The two aircraft were now 2 nautical miles apart. They were moving toward each other at a combined speed of over 2,000 feet per second. Miller saw the nose of the 14 track toward him. He knew what was coming. The Iranian was lining up for a snapshot. Miller pulled back on the stick, trying to bring the nose of the Raptor up into a high G climb. He wanted the sun behind him. He wanted the advantage. The jet did not move. The flight computer refused the command. A voice spoke in Miller's ear. It was the same rhythmic pulse, but now it sounded like words. It was a single word repeated over and over. "Stop." Miller froze. He did not know if the voice was in the radio or in his head. The distance was 1 nautical mile, 1.5 miles. The world was shrinking down to a single line between 2 cockpits. Neither side was turning away. Both sides were committed to the collision. The morning was becoming a blur of speed and light. The final seconds were beginning. 9:13 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. The gap between the two fighters was closing at over 3,000 feet per second. At this range, there was no time for deliberation. There was only instinct. Captain Miller in the Raptor saw the Iranian Tomcat bank hard to the left. It was a classic bracketing maneuver. The 14 was trying to force the Raptor into a defensive position where its superior thrust could not be used to escape. Miller gripped the flight stick. Guardian. Raptor 1. Contact is maneuvering aggressively. I am braking right to intercept. The response from the Combat Information Center was a wall of white noise. The satellite uplink that provided real-time data to the American fleet had vanished. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, the tactical displays were frozen. The admirals watched a static image of 2 icons that were no longer where the screen said they were. The rules of engagement were now a memory. Without a command link, the decision to fire rested solely on the shoulders of a 34-year-old pilot. Inside the Iranian cockpit, Major Javan felt the crushing weight of 5 G-forces as he pulled the nose of his Tomcat across the horizon. His eyes were locked on the Raptor. It was a gray splinter against the blue. His backseater, Farzad, was calling out the distance. 2,000 meters, Farzad shouted. He is turning with us. He is fast. Too fast. Javan ignored the strain in his neck. He was flying the aircraft with pure muscle memory. The electronics were still screaming, but the mechanical linkages of the 14 were holding. He flipped the cover off the missile launch button. In his mind, he was already at war. He believed the American was trying to lure him into a trap. He believed his only chance for survival was to strike first. Arming Sidewinders, Javan said. His thumb hovered over the launch cycle. In the American cockpit, Miller saw the Iranian jet wing sweep move forward. The Tomcat was slowing down to tighten its turn. It was an invitation to a dogfight. Miller checked his weapon status one last time. The screen was still a chaotic blur of red text. It read, "Weapon inhibited." Another line read, "System fault." Miller shouted into his mask, "Override. Give me the gun." He toggled the emergency manual override for the 20mm cannon. A small yellow light flickered on his side panel. It was the first sign of life from his systems in 3 minutes. He pulled the Raptor into a vertical spiral. He wanted to get above the Tomcat. He wanted to look down into the Iranian cockpit. Below them, the circular disturbance in the water was growing. The white eye in the ocean was now nearly a mile wide. It began to glow with a pale, bioluminescent light that reached up through the haze. Neither pilot noticed the sea. They were too busy trying to kill each other. The distance dropped to 1,000 meters. The two machines were now so close that the pilots could see the individual rivets on each other's wings. The air between them was charged with a static energy that made the hair on Miller's arms stand up beneath his flight suit. The command level in Washington was now receiving a frantic report from the Persian Gulf. The word skirmish was being used. The word escalation was being whispered. But for the two men in the sky, those words were meaningless. There was only the heat of the engines and the cold glass of the head-up display. Miller lined up the funnel for his gun. He had the 14 dead center. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. Javan, seeing the Raptor's nose pointed directly at him, slammed his thumb down on the Sidewinder launch button. The missile stayed on the rail. The two aircraft were now heading for a literal physical collision. The morning was about to reach its breaking point. 9:14 in the morning. Above the glowing eye of the Persian Gulf. The distance was now measured in hundreds of meters. At this range, the concept of a missile engagement was becoming obsolete. This was a knife fight in a telephone booth. Both pilots were committed. There was no room left for a professional break or a defensive role. To turn now was to present a wide, heat-soaked target to the enemy. Captain Miller gripped the flight stick of his F-22 so hard his knuckles turned white inside his gloves. He squeezed the trigger for the 20mm cannon again. He held it down. He expected the vibration of the 6-barrel Gatling gun to shake the nose of his aircraft. He expected the smell of cordite to seep into the cockpit through the environmental control system. The jet remained silent. The only sound in his ears was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his own heart, and that strange, pulsing interference on the radio. Miller shouted into his mask, "Guardian, Raptor 1, my master arm is hot. My trigger is depressed. No fire. Repeat, no fire." The Combat Information Center was still a wall of static. Miller was alone. He looked through the glass of his canopy and saw the Iranian F-14. It was 500 meters away. The Tomcat was a massive, predatory shape. He could see the camouflage pattern on its wings. He could see the individual digits of the tail number. Inside the Iranian cockpit, Major Javan was screaming at his systems. He had toggled every emergency switch on his weapon control panel. He had attempted to slave the Sidewinder missiles to his helmet-mounted sight. He had tried to fire the internal cannon. Nothing! Farzad yelled from the back seat. Everything is inhibited. Javan. He is right there. Javan looked across the narrow gap of air. He saw the American pilot. He saw the white helmet and the dark visor. For a split second, the geopolitical tension of 40 years vanished. There were only two men, trapped in two machines, hurtling toward each other at the speed of sound. The Iranian pilot felt a wave of cold sweat break across his forehead. He was a professional. He had flown hundreds of intercepts. He had never seen a system failure like this. It was as if the aircraft itself had developed a conscience. It was as if the metal and the software were refusing to participate in the violence. "He is not breaking," Farzad said. His voice was trembling. "Javan, he is not breaking." "Neither am I," Javan replied. Below them, the disturbance in the water reached its peak. The white, circular glow was now so bright it reflected off the bellies of both aircraft. The ocean seemed to be rising. A massive mound of water began to form in the center of the ring. It was a physical impossibility. Thousands of tons of seawater were being pulled toward the sky by an invisible force. The two aircraft were now 400 meters apart, 300. Miller watched the 14 fill his entire field of vision. He knew that in less than 3 seconds, they would collide. He had a choice. He could pull up and risk being shot in the back if the Iranians' weapons suddenly came online. Or he could hold his course and die with his honor intact. He chose to hold. He saw the Iranian pilot do the same. Both men were prepared to turn their billion-dollar machines into a single ball of fire over the Gulf. The air between the two jets began to shimmer. It looked like the heat haze over a desert road. But it was cold. The temperature inside Miller's cockpit dropped 20 degrees in a single second. Frost began to form on the edges of his displays. The distance was 200 meters. 100. The morning was about to vanish into a flash of metal and light. Both pilots closed their eyes for the impact. 9, 14, and 30 seconds in the morning, above the white eye of the Persian Gulf. The distance was no longer a tactical measurement. It was a physical wall. Captain Miller saw the F-14 Tomcat swell until it eclipsed the horizon. Its wings were swept back for maximum speed. The Iranian jet was a massive, twin-tailed predator. Its nose was pointed directly at the center of Miller's chest. The American pilot felt the air compress around his canopy. The F-22 began to shudder. It was the buffet of a shockwave that should not exist yet. Miller pulled his elbows into his ribs. He braced for the metal-on-metal impact that would turn two of the world's most advanced machines into a cloud of titanium confetti. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second. His brain processed the final image of the Iranian pilot. He saw the dark visor of Major Javan. He saw the gloved hand of the Iranian officer raised toward the glass. It was not a gesture of aggression. It was a reflex of defense. Inside the Iranian cockpit, the world had slowed to a crawl. Major Javan felt the vibration in his teeth. The F-14 was screaming. The airframe was at its absolute limit. The airframe was at its absolute limit. The white glow from the ocean below was now so intense that it bled through the floorboards of Don Percent. The cockpit. It filled the cabin with a cold, sterile light. 40 meters, Farzad shouted. His voice was a thin rasp. He is. The two aircraft merged. They passed each other with less than 40 meters of separation. At a combined closing speed of over 1,000 knots, the physical wake should have torn the wings off both planes. The sheer force of the displaced air should have sent both pilots into an unrecoverable, flat spin. Instead, there was a vacuum. As the Raptor and the Tomcat crossed, the air between them turned into a shimmering liquid. It was a dawn, ripple in reality. Miller felt the Raptor lurch, but not from turbulence. It felt as if the aircraft had been grabbed by a giant hand and moved 6 feet to the right in a single millisecond. The G-forces did not spike. They vanished. For one heartbeat, Miller was weightless. The engines of the F-22 went silent. The roar of the wind disappeared. In the Iranian jet, Javan experienced the same impossible transition. The violent shaking of the Tomcat stopped instantly. The cockpit was silent. The sparks on his instrument panel froze in midair. He looked to his left and saw the Raptor passing by. It was so close he could see the heat signature of its stealth coating. But the American jet was not moving, like a physical object. It was sliding through the air like a ghost. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, the radar screens did not just flicker. They went black. Every digital display in the Combat Information Center lost power simultaneously. The lights in the room dimmed to a faint orange glow. The tactical air officer reached for his backup radio. It was dead. The entire carrier strike group was suddenly deaf, dumb, and blind. The entire carrier strike group was suddenly deaf, dumb, and blind. 300 miles away, an American AWACS surveillance plane experienced a total system reboot. The flight crew watched as their consoles displayed a single line of code that none of them recognized. It was not a military language. It was a mathematical sequence that shouldn't have been possible in a standard operating system. Miller opened his eyes. He expected to see the debris of a collision. He expected to feel the cold bite of the atmosphere at 30,000 feet. He saw only the deep blue of the sky. He looked into his rearview mirrors. The F-14 was there. It was a mile behind him and climbing. His flight computers suddenly roared back to life. The screens flashed green. The weapon inhibited warnings vanished. His radar lock returned with a violent chime. The green box was back. He had a perfect firing solution on the Iranian's tail. Miller's finger hovered over the trigger. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had the shot. He could end it now. He could claim the kill and justify it as a defensive action. He looked at the Iranian jet. It was not maneuvering. It was not trying to get back into the fight. It was wobbling. Inside the Tomcat, Javan was struggling for control. His engines had flamed out. His hydraulic pressure was at zero. He was a stone falling from the sky. He looked at his mirrors and saw the Raptor turning. He knew the American had the lock. He waited for the flash of the missile motor. He waited for the end. The two pilots, once eager to strike, were now both paralyzed by what they had just experienced. The air around them felt heavy. The white eye in the water below had vanished. The ocean was calm once again. 9:15 in the morning. The sky over the Persian Gulf. Captain Miller stared at his head-up display. The green box was solid. The tone in his headset was a steady, high-pitched scream. It was the sound of a perfect infrared lock. The 14 was a sitting duck. It was drifting through the air, its engines trailing cold air after the flameout. Miller's thumb was heavy on the trigger. He only needed to press it. 1/2 inch of movement would end the encounter. He did not press it. "Guardian," Miller said. His voice was a whisper. "Raptor 1, I have the shot, but I am seeing something. Check your sweep. High and fast." On the USS Abraham Lincoln, the power had returned as suddenly as it had vanished. The screens flickered to life. The tactical air officer gasped. There was a new icon on the glass. It was not a friendly. It was not a hostile. The computer could not classify it. It was moving at 4,000 knots. It was at 80,000 feet. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was at 30,000 feet. The icon was positioned exactly between Raptor 1 and the Iranian Tomcat. Inside the Iranian cockpit, Major Javan was no longer looking at his instruments. He was looking at the air in front of his canopy. A distortion had appeared. It looked like a ripple in a pool of water. It was a sphere of shimmering air. It was roughly the size of a small car. It did not reflect the sun. It seemed to absorb it. "Albers," Javan gasped, calling to his backseater. "Do you see it?" "I see it," Farzad replied. "It is not a drone. It is not a missile." The sphere moved. It did not accelerate. It simply occupied a new position. One moment it was in front of the Tomcat. The next, it was hovering inches away from the wingtip of the American Raptor. Miller felt a jolt of electricity run through his flight stick. His cockpit displays changed. The green radar lock vanished. In its place, a single image appeared on all three of his primary screens. It was a map of the Earth, but it was not a modern map. The continents were shifted. The borders were gone. Over the Persian Gulf, a single gold pulse was radiating outward. A voice filled his headset. It was not the rhythmic heartbeat from before. It was clear. It was calm. It sounded like 1,000 voices speaking as one. "Enough." The word was spoken in English, then in Farsi, then in a dozen languages Miller did not recognize. The shimmering sphere expanded. It became a blinding flash of white light. Miller threw his arm up to shield his eyes. He felt the Raptor being pushed. It was not a violent shove. It was a firm, steady pressure that forced his aircraft into a wide bank to the west. Inside the Tomcat, Javan felt the same force. His aircraft was being steered to the east. His engines suddenly roared back to life. The fuel gauges jumped to full. The hydraulic pressure stabilized at perfect levels. The 14 was no longer falling. It was being escorted. The two pilots were being physically separated by a force they could not measure. The distance between them grew from 1 mile to 10, then 20. The shimmering sphere remained in the center of the sky. It sat motionless at 30,000 feet. It was a silent sentinel between two nations. On the USS Abraham Lincoln stood paralyzed. The new contact was now broadcasting a signal on every frequency. It was not a message of war. It was a data dump. Terabytes of information were flooding the carrier's servers. The pivot had happened. The tactical engagement was over. The mystery had just begun. 9:17 in the morning. Above the waters of the Gulf, the shimmering sphere was gone. One moment it had occupied the center of the sky, a silent arbiter between two warring nations. The next, it had vanished into a point of light that streaked upward until it was lost. In the glare of the sun, the air was empty. The sky was a deep, undisturbed blue. Captain Miller adjusted his oxygen mask. His hands were shaking. He could feel the fine tremors in his fingers against the flight stick. His F-22 was flying perfectly. The engines were humming, the digital displays were crisp and clear, but the enough message was still ringing in his ears. It was not a memory of a sound. It was a physical sensation in his skull. Miller keyed his radio. Guardian. Raptor 1. The unknown contact has departed. I am in the clear. Bearing 270. Requesting vector for return to base. The voice of the controller on the USS Abraham Lincoln came through. It was no longer frantic. It sounded hollow, shaken. Copy, Raptor 1. We have you on radar. You are clear for the carrier strike group. Maintain altitude at 30,000 feet. Be advised, we are experiencing technical anomalies across the fleet. Copy, Miller said. He looked into his mirrors. The Iranian F-14 was a tiny speck on the eastern horizon. It was moving away. It was heading home. Inside the Iranian cockpit, the silence was absolute. Major Javan watched the silver dot of the Raptor disappear into the haze of the west. His engines were running smoother than they ever had in 20 years of service. The old Tomcat felt brand new. Every gauge was centered. Every light was green. Javan, Farzad whispered from the back seat. What was that? Did we die? No, Javan replied. He looked down at his hands. We were stopped. By who? I do not think it was a who, Javan said. 9:22 in the morning. The Iranian coast. Major Javan crossed the shoreline of Iran. Usually, this was the moment of relief. Today, it felt like entering a different world. He looked at his navigation screen. It was flickering. It was no longer showing his coordinates. It was scrolling through a series of complex geometric shapes. They were shifting and rotating in 3 dimensions. Farzad, are you seeing the nav display? Yes, the radar intercept officer replied. It is not a map. It looks like a star chart. But the stars are wrong. The 2 pilots remained silent for the rest of the flight. They did not discuss the merge. They did not discuss the trigger pull. They both knew that they had attempted to kill a man they did not know for a reason they could no longer remember. The aggression that had fueled them 10 minutes ago had been replaced by a cold, heavy dread. 9:30 in the morning. The Combat Information Center. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, the data dump was still occurring. The servers were working at maximum capacity. The Admiral stood in the center of the room, watching the screens. The data was not code. It was not a virus. It was a massive archive of high-resolution imagery. The images were not of military targets. They were images of the Earth, from thousands of years ago, then hundreds of years ago, then yesterday. Each image was centered on the Strait of Hormuz. It was a time-lapse of human history in a single geographic point. The final image showed 2 aircraft, a Raptor and a Tomcat, frozen 40 meters apart. The Admiral looked at the tactical air officer. Can we stop the upload? No, sir, the officer replied. It is bypassing our firewalls. It is not using our hardware. It is projecting itself into the memory banks. The Admiral looked back at the screen. The image of the 2 jets began to zoom in. It focused on the cockpits. He could see Captain Miller. He could see Major Javan. The resolution was so high, he could see the sweat on their faces. They were going to hit each other, the Admiral whispered. Yes, sir, the officer said. They were at 0 distance. But the telemetry shows they didn't collide. They passed through the same space at the same time. The room went quiet. The professional certainty of the United States Navy was evaporating. They were looking at a physical impossibility. 10:30 in the morning. Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. The F-22 Raptor taxied into a hardened shelter. The engines whined to a stop. He did not move. He did not remove his helmet. He watched the ground crew approach with their ladders and diagnostic cables. Usually, After a high-tension intercept, the adrenaline would be fading into a dull ache. Today, there was only a sense of profound displacement. Inside the vault-like briefing room, intelligence officers waited. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why the most advanced stealth fighter in the world had failed to engage a 40-year-old target at point-blank range. Miller climbed down from the ladder. His legs felt heavy. He looked at his crew chief. The sergeant was staring at the side of the aircraft. There were no scorch marks. There were no stress fractures from the wake turbulence of the near collision. There was only a faint, shimmering residue on the leading edge of the wings. It looked like crushed diamonds. It caught the light of the hangar and refracted it into colors that Miller did not recognize. The crew chief spoke. "Sir, we ran the initial download. The flight computer says you never squeezed the trigger." Miller shook his head. "I squeezed it 3 times. I held it down. The log is clean, Captain," the chief responded. "It is like those seconds of the flight do not exist. There is a hole in the data. The computer shows the target. It shows the lock. Then there is a 3-second gap where the processor just stopped." Across the Gulf, at Bandar Abbas, Major Javan stood on the tarmac of Tactical Air Base 9. His 14 Tomcat was surrounded by technicians. They were shouting. They were pointing at the engines. The old Pratt & Whitney motors, usually covered in oil and soot, were spotless. They looked as if they had just come off the assembly line in 1974. Major Javan ignored them. He walked toward the command bunker. He was met by a general from the Revolutionary Guard. The general did not offer a salute. He looked angry. He looked like a man who had been promised a victory and received a riddle instead. The general spoke. "You had the American. Why did you not fire?" Javan looked the general in the eye. "I did fire, General. The missile did not leave the rail. The sky stopped me." "The sky is a place," the general growled, "not a person." "Whatever was up there today," Javan said, "it acted with intent. It was not a jammer. It was a hand." Back in Qatar, Miller was sitting in a small, windowless room. A digital recording of his head-up display was playing on a loop. It showed the green box over the Tomcat. It showed the range dropping to 0. Then, at the moment of the merge, the video turned into a single frame of white light. An analyst pointed at the screen. "We checked the weapon systems, Captain. There is no hardware failure. The missiles are perfect. The cannon is fully functional. But the firing signal was inhibited. Not jammed. Inhibited. Something reached into the bus architecture of the Raptor and rewrote the command in the final millisecond. It told the missile to stay on the rail. It told the computer that the target was a friendly." "Is it a Chinese hack?" Miller asked. The analyst paused. "No. To do this, you would need to be inside the processor of every missile and every circuit simultaneously. You would need to move faster than the speed of electricity. We are looking at a level of technology that is not on any known map." The room went silent. The realization was beginning to sink in. This was not a military failure. It was a physical intervention. The morning was fading into a tense afternoon. Both nations were reviewing the same impossible data. The mystery was no longer about the pilots. It was about the power that had reached into their cockpits and said no. 3 days later, Washington and Tehran. The event, now known in the highest levels of intelligence as the Ghost Merge, was the most protected secret in 2 hemispheres. The tension in the Persian Gulf had not vanished, but it had changed. The aggressive posturing had been replaced by a cautious, almost reverent silence. Both the American and Iranian fleets had pulled back from the line of contact. They were no longer looking at each other. They were looking at the sky. Inside the National Security Agency, a team of the world's leading cryptographers sat in a room without windows. They were staring at a single string of data, recovered from Captain Miller's F-22 Raptor. It was the data from the 3 seconds that should not have existed. It was not a computer virus. It was not a foreign code. One analyst pointed to a sequence on the monitor. It is a mathematical signature. It is based on the vibration of hydrogen atoms. It is universal. It is not something a human being wrote. The same discovery was being made in a bunker outside Tehran. The Iranian technicians had found the identical string in the flight recorder of the 14. The sequence was a mirror image. When the two data strings were overlaid, they formed a perfect three-dimensional map of the Strait of Hormuz. But the map showed something that was not there. It showed a massive, submerged structure beneath the floor of the Gulf, a structure that had been there for 10,000 years. Captain Miller was currently at a secure facility in Nevada. He had been debriefed for 72 hours straight. He had told the story of the trigger pull and the rhythmic heartbeat 100 times. Each time, his voice remained steady. He did not talk about fear. He talked about the silence. He talked about the feeling of being a child whose hand had been gently but firmly moved away from a flame. Major Javan was in a similar room in Isfahan. He was being treated as a hero by the state media, but in private, he was being interrogated. His superiors wanted to know if he had made a secret pact with the American. They could not accept the truth. They could not accept that their best pilot had been neutralized by a force that did not care about their revolution or their borders. Neither pilot has ever explained what happened in those 40 meters of separation. Perhaps because there are no words in any human language for the feeling of a physical law being rewritten in real time. They had both gone into the sky as warriors. They had come down as witnesses. Strategic analysts would later agree that a full-scale war had been avoided by a margin of less than a second. If either missile had left the rail, the chain reaction of escalations would have been unstoppable. The global economy would have collapsed. Thousands would have died in the first hour. The intervention was not just a technical failure. It was a message. It was a reminder that the most advanced weapons on the planet are only as powerful as the environment allows them to be. We are not the masters of the sky. We are guests in it. The morning over the Persian Gulf is quiet now. The sun rises over the water, turning the surface into a sheet of polished glass. The white eye in the ocean is gone. The shimmering spheres are gone. But the pilots who fly the narrow corridors of the strait now keep their fingers a little further from the trigger. They look at their radar screens and they wonder. They know that something is watching, and they know that it is not finished.